On this day, 7th of February 1992, the Treaty on European Union, also known and more popularly known as the Maastricht Treaty, was signed in the Dutch town of Maastricht. It was this treaty which established the European Union. Before this, there had been something called the European Economic Community, and later the European Community. It was in the pages of this treaty where the single currency first started. The idea of a single currency and the commitment towards a single currency began. And it was also in this treaty where many of the problems and weaknesses of the present European Union began. The signing of a treaty such as Maastricht might seem, and is in many ways, quite dry, kind of boring, doesn't really enthuse people. But it has proven to be one of the most important documents that European countries have signed and agreed to in the past half century. And it wasn't a mistake. Problems in the Treaty of Maastricht, the shortcomings, I believe, are there on purpose. I'll tell you more about that later. So, what happened before Maastricht? What was happening around this time? The year before Maastricht was signed, so only a few months before, 3 months maybe, the Soviet Union had dissolved. It was gone. The Eastern Bloc was gone. East Germany, well, that had been reunited with the West to create the modern German state. Things were in flux. The Cold War was over. The Gulf War had been fought and won. It was a mess on the international scene. But amongst this mess, there were certain actors vying to make this mess their own, vying to remake the world, as a certain Anthony Blair would say a decade later. France was, in many ways, probably the most important member of the European Economic Community. It was France that had dominated it from the beginning, and it was France that now was concerned about German power, about a resurgent Germany in Europe. And let's be honest, in the past, from that point, century and a bit, France had been invaded 3 times by Germany. It had been defeated twice. Its power had been smashed by a united Germany. So the fact that Mitterrand allowed Germany to become united was quite amazing, but he did want something in return. Now, I say allowed Germany because up to this point, Germany had a limited sovereignty. West Germany and East Germany. This was because of the Potsdam Agreement. The occupying powers, allies, the Americans and the British and the French, as well as the Soviets in the East, had a say over internal German politics and policies, and could very well have denied the right of Germany to unite in 1990. Helmut Kohl, who was the German leader, paid off the Soviets And that was quite easy at the time because the Soviets were in a desperate situation. Gorbachev, well, he was running his country into the ground, literally. It was not going to survive very long. And so Helmut Kohl offered to pay for all the troops to leave East Germany. And he also went to Moscow and was very happy to give low-interest loans and grants and just give money, because Germany at this point was a very wealthy country. Nowadays, Germany's still wealthy, but it's a bit moribund. Whereas back then, Germany was on top of the world, hardly any debt, loads of money. So they could do that. They could bribe the Soviet Union to pull out of East Germany and give their blessing to reunification, which they did. The Americans were also quite on board because they looked at a united, powerful, wealthy Germany in the middle of Europe. That'd be great for them. Germany could take care of Europe. Wouldn't have to be the Americans anymore. Great. And it would also put the icing on the cake on their victory in the Cold War. Margaret Thatcher, on the other hand, was implacably opposed, and she wrote notes on briefing papers that she got from the Foreign Office complaining about this, and she wanted to oppose it. And she could have if she had wanted to, but when the other great powers, the other occupying powers, the high contracting parties as they were known, if they are all for the United Germany, it's going to be hard for her to hold out. So she was hoping that the French, François Mitterrand, would be on her side. And he sounded, when you talked to her, he sounded like he was on her side. However, Mitterrand, being the implacably goat-like villain of the story that he always seems to be, was very clever. And so he was able to play both sides. Talking to Margaret Thatcher, he was implacably opposed to German reunification. When he was talking to the Americans, the Soviets, he was very open, but he wanted it to go a little bit slower, to be a bit more responsible. And between him and the Germans, he had a different ploy. With the Germans, he said, okay, we can, but as always, we must run Europe. That's not exactly what he said, but probably with flowery, nice language. That's basically what he wanted. France would dominate Germany diplomatically, militarily, politically. Germany would be allowed to dominate economically, because they would anyway. But the price of German reunification was Maastricht Treaty, single currency, and a single defense and security policy. Helmut Kohl was quite happy to go along with this, because it was long into the future. But things wouldn't necessarily work out the way anyone really had foreseen or hoped. Helmut Kohl had to give up his claim on land beyond Oder-Neisse line. That's the modern eastern boundary of Germany. Up until this point, he had not, because he said it was for a future German government to negotiate with Poland the eastern border. The French and pretty much everyone else said, nah, you gotta recognize that border. So he did, and with the French, he agreed to European currency, a single European currency, a single European defense and security policy, and a new federalized Europe, or a Europe that was going towards federalism. The treaty itself was all about as in their words they said it, they wanted an ever closer Europe. So an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. And the first part of the treaty brought together all the various organizations that had been hanging around, had not really been a part of anything else. So they brought together the European Economic Community, the EEC, the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Atomic Energy Community, and various other smaller organizations. They brought them all together to create the European Union. Now, the second part amended the Treaty of Rome, renaming it the European Community, because they wanted it to reflect the broader ambition of this new European Union. And they also established, or put in the wording to establish, a European Central Bank, a European Common Currency. They also established, the first time, European citizenship, so that's when everyone's passports became the same kind of burgundy colour. Everyone around Europe has to have the same sort of passport, same colour passport. It has to have the European Union on it. More of a, what do you call it, a gimmick than anything else. It didn't really go any further than that. There was already freedom of movement and freedom of capital and freedom of, what was the other one? The three basic freedoms: capital, movement of labour, and there's another one. Anyway, it also established the European Ombudsman. Don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. It expanded the structural fund, so that's to give money to poorer areas for their infrastructure, things like that. And it also gave the European Parliament more rights. So the European Parliament would have not only the right of consultation, but of co-decision. So they could actually make decisions in the European Parliament, although it is very limited. Back in 2003, I think it was, the European Parliament did dismiss the entire Commission because there was one or two corrupt people in it. There was a French one who was doing something, I can't remember what she was doing. And the head of the Commission apparently was an idiot. But they couldn't just get rid of them. The only thing they could do was to get rid of the entire Commission and start again, which they did, which was quite a big thing back then. But they're not able to just dismiss one. So the European Parliament got more power, but it's still very difficult for a parliament of that stature to have the rights and powers of national parliaments. It's not really made for that. Okay, and then there was the foreign and security and defence policy. So here, this is definitely what the French wanted. It was made very vague, so people could ignore it, which they did up until very recently, and even now, I think it's more talk than anything else. I don't think countries like Italy or Spain or Ireland or Sweden actually want to be part of a common defence and security and foreign policy thing. They'll tell the French what they want to hear, and they'll do a few things and some gimmicky things, and then they'll ignore it again. I would assume. I can't imagine all these countries would want the same defence policy or the same army. How would that even work? Who do you give the orders to? Which language would you give the orders in, and who would you give it to? Would the French be talking French to the Germans and the Italians? Would the Germans be talking German to the Poles and the Czechs? Problem there. And so this is how it began. But it wasn't actually universally popular when it was signed. The politicians obviously love it because this is a license to print money for them. Lots of new jobs for them, positions, when they're thrown out of politics in their home countries. When they lose elections or they retire, they can go off to Brussels and Strasbourg and Luxembourg, and they'll have a nice position where they don't have to do much. They can talk nice things, go to dinner, have nice wine, good food, lots of money, expenses out the wazoo. It's great for them. But the people weren't as impressed as the politicians. The Danes rejected it in a referendum in their country. The French almost did. Just over 50% of French people voted for it. There was a big reaction against Maastricht. A lot of the French did not like it at all. And in Britain, it almost brought down the Conservative Prime Minister John Major. And from here on in, his ability to run the country was hobbled. The Maastricht Rebellion in the House of Commons damaged him, and later on in 92, 93 I think it was, there was the Black Wednesday. So Britain and Italy on the same day were thrown out of the ERM, and between that and Maastricht, his premiership was done. And in 1997, Conservatives went from 330-something MPs down to 165. That's what happens when you do things that are unpopular, and when you commit yourself to this ideology, which was very unpopular back home. And it was also at this point, the very beginnings of Brexit began. The Referendum Party was established by Jimmy Goldsmith around this time, and the Referendum Party is a direct ancestor of UKIP, and, the Brexit Party. So it was around here when it all started to come together. The Maastricht Treaty and its eventual passing in 1993 created the European Union. And for many people, it was assumed it was just a changing of the name of the EEC, or the European Community. That it was the same deal, and many people didn't understand the fuss amongst some in France and in Denmark and in Britain against this new organisation, which for many wasn't new, it was just changing of the name. But it would, in following decades, become apparent that this was an organisation with the pretension of being a nation-state, or maybe even something more than a nation-state, as Guy Verhofstadt has said, an empire. Democratic empire. A democratic empire that is committed to human rights and all the good fluffy things that everyone likes. But many people didn't like the way it was going. And we've seen with the single European currency, a straitjacket has been put on many of the countries and the economies of Europe, especially the economies like Italy, where it hasn't grown its GDP in 20 years. Portugal and Spain and Greece, which have been overloaded with debt because of their spending and because of their inability now to print money. Even France has been economically, although not as badly as other countries, it has been held back, many say. And there are many sovereigntists in France who chafe at what they believe to be an imposition upon France's natural independent sovereignty. Pretty much the only country where it's been universally popular is Germany. Maastricht ended up working out very well for Germany. The euro has been a godsend because of Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece. It's kept the value of the euro quite low, which means that Germany can export to its heart's content. They can make lots of money, stable currency, can't be printed too much, but it won't go up in value because of the far-flung parts of the European Union who aren't as economically successful as the Germans. It's done well for Holland as well, and Austria and a few others. In some ways, France has benefited a lot out of the European Union. They have dominated it politically and now militarily, and with Britain gone, they pretty much run the show with Emmanuel Macron, Jupiterian figure, sitting in the Élysée Palace. But this also caused resentments. Ireland twice has rejected treaties, Lisbon and Nice. Both times, the political elites in Ireland and across the European continent cajoled, bribed, threatened voters in Ireland. The Danes rejected Maastricht initially and were given the same opt-outs that Britain had. And then they had another referendum just so they could pass it this time. Britain had Brexit, obviously, after a long campaign by some far out there political nobodies. They ended up winning and withdrawing eventually from the European Union. There's problems with Poland. There's problems with Hungary. There's problems in Italy. And this instinct to centralize everything, I believe, will be the EU's undoing. The whole point of a federation is that powers are given to local people, local areas, local states, or land or regions. And the European Union has a different sort of instinct. It wants to centralize power, centralize decisions, which, if it really wanted to be a federal Europe, surely it should only be touching on decisions that it should do, like very basic things like trade, maybe defense, foreign policy, but it should be leaving other things towards the nation states. And it does seem that the European single currency has not been the outstanding success that they all hoped it would be 20 years ago. So that's it, the Maastricht Treaty. A treaty which has led to many of the events of the past 20 years. Has led to Brexit, has led to resentments and bankruptcy in places like Greece, and who knows where it's going to bring us next. Like these videos, like, subscribe, and leave a like.